Okay, Katerina, if you are, and sorry, Tanzil, Gabriela, and Sarai, thank you so much. That was really, really great second session. You guys had what is the graveyard shift, the post-lunch session. So thank you for bringing such great energy to that. Gabriela, we hope you got to your destination, and we appreciate you suddenly connecting en route. We had you doing this, we had Daphne doing this. It's been really interesting to see that how far we can push these sort of interconnectivities and mobilities simultaneously. So we're going to go to the last portion of the day. This is just 15 minutes or so, even less, Katrina, if you can, there's no pressure. But Katrina, our organizer of this event, is going to share some reflections on the day, maybe some observations, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit as a group. And then we'll sort of wrap up. But again, all of this is being captured on the Miro, and this recording is made available afterwards. So feel free to drop comments either here, WhatsApp me, somebody emailing me, I can bring them up. But I know somebody can't access the chat, which is a limitation of the centralized team system. So, Katrina, will you ready, please?
Could you also send the links to the Miro board? Because I see no links to the Miro board either. So that'd be useful later.
I'll do it right, yeah, exactly. I'll send all that out.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we were very privileged to hear very different angles today. Usually we are confined sometimes to, the silos of our disciplines. And I think the collection of speakers that we heard today are coming from architecture, urban design, urban planning, public policy, urban policy, urban studies, giving us, a very rich understanding of the different struggles. Perhaps I'm just going to mention a few things to recap, kind of to remind ourselves what were some of the core messages, but also some cross-cutting elements that I saw kind of emerging. Even though I would have liked to hear more, what are the struggles of the PhDs that have been joining this group? Because I think there are some of the struggles that perhaps were not fully captured in the discussion. And I think that, elements that remain, and maybe we can discuss a bit about that element afterwards. So something that is very clear is that there's not, the Southern perspective of values is not something that is set on a stone, that it's something that is totally defined, but rather a constant inquiry, a type of longing, an ethos, perhaps more an orientation and a will to unlearn rather than something that we can ascribe to a single set of mandates. Some of you mentioned a lot the visa. And I think, something that perhaps gets overlooked, particularly when we are speaking from, places of the belly of the empire, is that it makes a different, set of subjectivities that are shaped given to your migration story. And most of the things that were shared today, are very personal stories. Each one of the practices that were explained today come from the genealogy and the background of each one of the speakers. And I think that is not trivial, right? And I think that is very important also in how we shape our affections and networks of connections. Right, the doing nothing of Tanzil sometimes is the nothing that matters the most in terms of developing the bonding, the connection that actually gives what I have called the affective infrastructure of knowledge co-production. And I think that affective infrastructure of knowledge co-production sometimes is very linked to perhaps what Gautam mentioned earlier in terms of, how you are implicated and to what extent something that is crucial for Southern practice is being implicated, right? Rather than a passive, teller of something that happens out there. But what happens with something is, really hitting you and implicate you. And what are the dimensions that get capture or not in the type of scholarship you do. And I think that is why we end up with many existential crises when we even question ourselves in, why we do what we do and how can we actually operate differently. I think all of the people that presented today have posed the same question in different ways in terms of how I do differently, knowing all the limitations, the contradictions that are in place, both in the institutions we work around, in the very practice of urban development, and also in the profoundly uneven and toxic environment of white academia, right? And I think that is something that, percolated somehow some of the things that we heard today. I think Olu explained to us a very, beautiful perspective in how, how can even we start thinking what the archive is, how to get access to the archive, rehashing the idea of the archive to write different histories. And the role of history, I think, is fundamental to think a different framework of, what are the histories that we can tell, particularly around architecture and the built environment. So, and how in that process you are also enabling institutional infrastructures for those students to actually be implicated in the case of the countries where Olu have been working. I think that is a brilliant work that oftentimes, don't get captured in the beautiful publications or the things that university values, but is that, the invisible labor of fostering and shaping spaces of opportunity for the new generations is, I think, one of the most valuable elements that perhaps that resonates also with the ideas that Tansil was bringing in terms of those collective infrastructures of exchange and solidarity that go beyond the traditional stereotypical hierarchical ways of how we communicate and exchange besides or outside the professional corpus or conferences, which I think, in my perspective, are very, very hierarchical, very reproducive of a type of power structures that I'm not happy with. And I think working outside them, it's like something that resonates as a way to go. The other element, I think it was very interesting, and what I said earlier, this idea of operationalization. And I think Gabriela illustrated beautifully how can we understand that, right? In terms of both the politicization of the work we do and therefore the political relevance, hopefully, of the things that we engage with, but also in terms of the legibility / illegibility of the things we do in terms of being able to actually talk with different audiences and how to make, have, in a way, ripple effects of our work in those moments where there's a sense or openings of political opportunity. I think many of the presentations are trying to seize the moment in terms of, practicing knowing that this is a long durée process, both the career that we engage with, but also the urban transformation processes, and how can we have a better understanding of that temporal element of it, right? And the patience was something that was mentioned a lot, the long durée of things. And I think that long durée temporality is something that somehow, the corporate neoliberal university is not interested in. And therefore, we need to find ways to work and maneuver within those kind of contradictions and clashes of rationales. Something also interesting that perhaps Beatrice illustrated very well is also how can we use the space of the pedagogical practice as a space of experimentation. And I've been very interested in these questions about pedagogy, trying to think about what we can consider critical urban pedagogy and how can we use that space of the classroom, as bell hooks have said, as this space of possibility and the space where we have agency actually to shape and understand and prompt different ways of thinking and feeling in terms of how we produce our understandings of the urban. The other element that came up very strongly in the work of Gabriela refers also to policy evaluation and how we engage with these kind of big infrastructural interventions. And oftentimes that work of the policy evaluation is something that perhaps urbanists don't learn much from, and where a lot of things are at stake, and perhaps most of the important investment by multilateral agencies are shaping literally the cities that we study and work with. And sometimes perhaps those ideas that are coming more from critical urban development and policy evaluation can also help us to understand that question about operationalization that is central, it seems, to all what we've been discussing today. The other aspect that was present in the discussion was this idea of dirty research that Tanzil brought up here, and somehow trying to understand how we can also address the issues of, the extractivism, the exhaustion was a word that came up many times, both exhaustion of the researchers, but also of communities and groups that, we go over and over again. And I think that poses several ethical questions for every one of us. And in a way, trying to think and doing things differently also, is a call for us in not just reproducing kind of the status quo as usually all the calls and all the funding strategies that are, produced here are pushing us to do. We're not even going to mention the details about how funding and how the strategies of funding research is actually very harmful to any ethics of engagement, let alone any approach to Southernness. For anyone connected to the UK research system, you have suffered that, and we continue to kind of really, really struggle to actually even make the case why even matters to work internationally and how that is relevant for the local. And I think that poses very serious questions when we are not even able to allocate funding to the people and the places we care for. The other aspect that I think was part of the concluding element also has to do with the ideas of comparativism, but also occupations and how to think from difference and what does it mean to understand Global South cities from the notion of occupation, which I think is very, very interesting. So a few things kind of came across. Some of the speakers talk less about the coloniality, more about an otherwise practice, a decentering practice, a dirty research. So different names have been kind of also emerging, kind of giving us a bit of expanding a bit the vocabulary that we have used for it. The legal action was present in some of the talks in terms of understanding the legal action kind of also as in one sense as the ultimate space for impact of the practice, which I think is interesting to question. Perhaps we didn't hear much about what are the articulations around the state and what is the connection between the statehood and practice in the Southern context. And maybe that is something, some space still to discuss and go deeper about it. Issues about justice and equality, to what extent we are also just extending a Fraserian framework to other contexts, right? And I know that Tanzil organized an event around justice and decolonizing kind of justice perspectives. I've been, very fond in these discussions around epistemic justice and how we go about it in terms of, knowledge co-production strategies. However, I think that we are very constrained in just reproducing, what is out there besides justice, and to what extent we are just governed for a very Western approach to justice kind of as a horizon, right? And I think perhaps that is something that in some strands, particularly in urban studies and planning, have been revisited for, kind of renewing perspectives on perhaps using ideas of liberation, in other cases, elements that room still for expanding discussions around it. Maybe also some tension that arises there is this idea of legibility and illegibility and the work of translation in terms of, maneuvering and navigating practice. There has been a lot of work, and Abdul Malik Simon has worked a lot about this idea of opacity. So to what extent opacity and legibility as a precondition to impact practice, is informing us? right? I think that is a tension that could be a productive space to actually push a bit more. How are we understanding Southern practice? And perhaps something that came up without intending perhaps at the beginning is the role of archive and how we are understanding archive both as a space for shaping the, what counts as knowledge, but also as a strategy for rewriting different histories, but also as a strategy for actually accounting for contemporary practice. And so that's something that, I don't know, I open up different questions in terms of, what is the role we give to archives in the type of practice we do, and to what extent are we even archiving ourselves in terms of how can we navigate our production, our reflection that sometimes we're very not great at, let's say, precisely for the fast science approach where we have to deliver, and not enough time to actually record our reflection. So I think those were some of the elements that I thought were kind of the more prominent in the discussion. But I could be very happy to hear my colleagues in terms of understanding also the reactions, the takeaway points, and to what extent these speak to the main struggles that you as a collective have been also facing. I see here some of my PhD students, and I know they've been grappling with a lot of this clash of trying to survive an environment that is, very UK centric with a very particular set of values, bringing and coming from different parts of the world, perhaps with different set of expectation as well. So over to you, Jono and Lubna.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you everyone, but especially Katrina. Katrina, I think, has been part of our journey from the start. I remember catching her at a very different event and giving her our kind of house date before we'd written that document zero. It was just like a set of kind of like basically 50 questions that we hadn't turned into a document. But it was like question after question after question. It was, how do we find somebody else to answer these questions? And so it's really lovely to kind of see something kind of going full circle and at the end reflecting back to us. I'm a bit overwhelmed, especially because you used the word struggle. And in a sense, for me, one of those big struggles was actually just making sense of practice, or just of context and how to make that. I think in the thematic descriptions of faith, the way that you describe the introduction faith in terms of like servicing, that the invisible, in a sense, doing that. And for me, just having this community, having this bunch of people and watching the evidence, everybody finds their own ways, and that doing it in a very idiosyncratic way and figuring out how to do it. And hoping that you are understood and realizing that you are understood not necessarily by the majority of people, but by a couple of people, and you meet some other people who also expect you. And that's such a lovely thing, So that's been really certainly transformational. So thank you to the collective for kind of producing those moments where that's kind of possible, where the struggle can have that kind of good.
Yeah, I think what I have from my input, we've asked, there's so many people online, there's so many people in this room who came to join us today about this finish of food. Yeah, it's been nice maybe hear a few points, even if it's, I think we did this in our exercises, we asked people to just sort of say one word or to just give like a sort of brain scan of what they're feeling in this moment. So maybe these last 2 minutes that we have, so the end of almost a year-long process of, as we were saying, like revisiting, checking in with each other, lots of coffees and teas and sighs and head shakes and things. Maybe there's a people online who've been part of this, but they just want to offer a word or a sentence or a sound even.
It's easiest for you. I have a fixation at Menti, so that's an option. But I'm actually going to now, I know that we've asked for a lot of your time repeatedly, all of you, and we're so grateful for that. I'm going to ask for one more in whatever format is easiest for you. If it's Miro, then join us in Miro. If it's unmuting and speaking out right now, do it that way. If it's going back to Menti, we've made a little exit poll. It's got 10 questions, but only 3, and they're all lots of emojis. So it's just kind of, it's 3 questions around what did you like, what did you not like, what would you want to see more of? There's in a sense of the 3 questions, and then there's more if you really want to. For those who are really dying. All I want to say is I'm really grateful for your thoughts, your input, your community, and I am listening in whatever format this is, whether it's on the live call or whether it's maybe tapping us on the shoulder if you see us in person or email us later, or whether it's on Menti or Miro or whatever. We're really grateful, and we love your thoughts on what we do with this, what you want to be part of this with us. So if you have anything more to say that we haven't yet, even if it's one word. So I'll just keep that up for the moment. Take a screenshot of that if you can. And it's a new Menti code. It's not the same as the old one because this one is more actually flexible. This voting is closed. Can you go to screenshot? Sorry, I tried to do this from my phone, but for some reason my phone won't let me unlock it. Sorry. So hopefully you have a screenshot of this and we'll email this out. The other thing is John and I have a very long list of people to say thank you to. We began this, the start, but really, there's more people than I can name here. I'm particularly grateful to those people who've kind of discussed these ideas with us, and all the informal conversations that kind of led up to this over the last year and previously. And to all the people who've been part of our sessions and spoken up in them, or even not spoken up, but just kind of had their camera on and nodded along. That kind of told me there's some sense in the kind of things that we're questioning and not just being behind it. But also to the lab, to the Urbanist, to the VPU, to BUD, to the VSA, so it's a long list. And we definitely thank you, John. Did you get it? I can do that.
Yeah, you want to start sharing?
I will stop sharing and get the exit formatted thing working. But in the meantime, I'm going to be sure.
Yeah, we have 9 minutes technically. So here's the time, the chime in, chip in to big coins. We'll just sit here for a few minutes. And then pedagogical silence on Zoom. Teams. Again, put you on the spot just because you just were influential in some of the early ideas, but any sort of observations or reflections?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I've been thinking about today is this idea of pedagogy and and this idea of teaching as practice, the influential way in which particularly some of the speakers in the first session were talking about the way that they use their teaching as a way of as a way to inspire a longer term, sort of more sustainable practice, I guess. And I'm planning and hoping to start doing some PGTA work from September. So I think that some of the texts that were recommended there, I think, or I hope, are going to be quite useful of starting to think about it as a sort of sort of practice, like this teaching as practice, and using teaching as a way to try and put some of the ideas that have been discussed here into other people's minds, to try and share these ideas, so that it's kind of, this is the beginning of a process. I think that's something that we've discussed as well, is like this constant ongoing, evolving ethics of practice, I guess, which we kind of discussed a little bit today as well. So yeah, I guess that's just a sort of rambling nonsense, but generally, like, put me on the spot and I said what was in my mind.
I believe there was a sort of Eastern urbanism.
Yeah, or the global East people talk about, but that's also kind of as problematic as global North and global South, and this the idea of the global East, or the post-socialist world, and how that fits into these sort of binary dichotomies of North and South, or first world, third world, and trying to use it as a way to, yeah, I guess, upset these simplistic binaries, to reflect on the fact that there are other alternatives that don't necessarily fit within the widely discussed kind of either like the center, or like the decolonial, post-colonial critique of the center, and the way that I mean, I've kind of sat back in these sessions because I don't know so much about many of the contexts that have been spoken about here, but it's been quite interesting to reflect on that in terms of my own knowledge of that part of the world. And yeah.
The session we had really small, so we could sit with kind of half-formed ideas, or like early critiques, and they could sort of land a little bit, even around from our ideas that shifted a little bit. And I think that helped me really particularly, because it was the first time there, you brought this very vulnerably, brought this idea that you were thinking through, and it really helped shape the whole conversation. You can see it in the mirror board, actually, how it like almost track how the conversation was affected by that. But I think what it does is, someone doesn't agree with it, or they don't see it fitting, or they do see it fitting, it like sets a chain reaction of other thoughts. Like, oh, what about, I never thought about that, like it's my context. And just like you were saying yourself now about like to make you think about the expression of ethics and like care, and like how to protect. I'm sure there's a context in your mind that you associate with that to your own work. And I think that was really nice about the doctoral space, was that I think one of us could bring parts of ourselves that we couldn't really bring to our supervisors, or to like our senior colleagues, or maybe even our peers. Like in my PhD program, there's not many people grappling with this. So losing geography, you're in the surviving studies, Haley's all over the place. So I was in a master's program, and I'm back at home. Like I found what is so nice about these things, by not having such a fixed, like it's a very fixed concept, but not such a fixed principle, that we could recontextualize together, which I really appreciate. I really like that about these spaces. That's my reflection of like the kind of last few months.
It's a universality in the kind of things that people are grappling with, in terms of, you think you're working in silo, you think you're working in a vacuum, and you sort of always thinking, why are things so difficult? Why are we not getting as many successes that we think we should be getting? And you just realize that a lot of the work is difficult. We are doing a lot of difficult work, and so it's not always easy successes. In fact, it's hardly easy successes.
Yeah, I think something that has also quite landed for me is this term that April has repeated, operationalizing. And I'm just thinking about, in terms of the work that I'm doing, how that also requires translating the language that we have, but not only translating, but actually reframing it into like a different mode of thinking, which is something I've come across a lot with the work that I do. For example, I guess I'm taught in English and I do a lot of things in English, but now when I'm operationalizing my work, I've tried to like translate a lot of things in Setswana. And oftentimes there's, of course, a lot of tension within that. A lot of things are lost in translation. Some things just, aren't there. And so I have to like reframe my mind completely in the way that I like perceive the world and the language that I then use in academia. So yeah, that's one thing that's quite positive and encouraging about, you know, trying to practice sort of the things that we think about, is that, yeah, you end up learning quite a bit and having to, you know, reframe even your own mind in terms of how you're thinking about things.
You see, it's not necessarily your film, but I think these concepts speak somewhat of your work.
It does. I mean, as a historian, I was quite drawn to some of the reflections earlier on about the archive. And I think, you know, having learned a little bit about architecture in the field through the circle, I've always been struck by including today's earlier session about the sort of multiple ways in which the archive can be used. Somebody said something very important about how it ought not to be left to the devices of historians alone, that as a method, as an act, as a verb, it has so much purchase in the work that we do, both professionally as researchers, but also in the practice-based work that architects especially are engaged in. So I've learned quite a lot in how beyond historical research, beyond, you know, the rightfully criticized sort of monolithic way of academic work, which is the journal article, I've learned in this space that there are quite far more potentialities for the archive to live and to be engaged publicly in ways that perhaps historians have not yet got to that point, because it's still this silo, still this individual working in isolation. I'm from Cambridge, where the archive has a particular meaning for historians, and I'm learning in ways that, you know, architects are not only critiquing, you know, that checkered past of the archive, but also opening up in very interesting ways, which I think has far much more potential to have the impact that I think we all want archives to have. Ola mentioned a lot, you know, mentioned a lot of things about, say, the Mau Mau archive in the UK. And there are a lot of conversations at the moment about, you know, repatriation of objects. And I think we are still yet to even have that conversation about how much, say, Southern archives are in the North as well, which is another very interesting tension, which leads to so many talented young researchers and scholars having to come here to open up that archive, but also to try and facilitate this, you know, sort of communication of the work that we do here back home. And this is where questions around language and translatability come in. And these are all very interesting. And I think somebody earlier said it's always useful to be in a forum like this to truly appreciate that some of the challenges that we face between the four walls of libraries or labs are shared by many other scholars around the world.
That's a really great way to wrap up today. We had help us, and we don't want to break anyone's brains. But thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you guys for coming in person. Thank you all the online people for hanging out with us for the whole day. We're going to make all of the recordings available. We're going to share a summary of the Miro board and the Menti findings. So yeah, in a sort of concern of transparency and flexibility, and that is all going to be made public. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a rest of a good day. And for those of us in the North, good academic year end. And we wish you the best. Any last words?
Just a massive thank you to everyone for giving us a chance to think, experiment, learn from each other, and to just have the space to do that. That's more than I can ask for.
Katrina, the last word.
Well, and don't forget to have joy and rest, you know,
Yes.
Rest is resistance. You rebel against the oppressor of academia, please.
Amazing. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
I know.
Oh gosh, I really am tasting.